The range was loud that morning. Not the sharp, cracking loud of a single round finding its mark, but the layered, overlapping thunder of a dozen rifles firing in inconsistent rhythm. The sound of people still learning where their shots were supposed to go. The air carried the metallic bite of spent brass and gun smoke, that particular smell that never fully leaves a person once it gets into them. It settles somewhere behind the eyes, behind the chest, and it stays. She stood at lane 7, her jaw set, her shoulders pulled slightly inward, not from weakness, but from the specific tension of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has learned to carry it quietly. Her name was Dara Ellison, 34 years old, former competitive shooter, or at least she used to be. That was the version of herself she no longer talked about at family dinners or first dates, because explaining who she used to be always required explaining what had happened in between. And that story never landed softly. She had driven 2 hours to get here. Not because this particular range was anything special. The lighting was harsh, the lane dividers were cracked and yellowed with age, and the ventilation system worked at maybe 60% capacity on a good day. She had driven 2 hours because she needed to be somewhere that no one knew her name, somewhere she could be nobody for a few hours. Just another person working a trigger in the general direction of a paper target. That was the plan, anyway. Her current rifle, a bolt-action she'd picked up at an estate sale 3 years ago, was giving her trouble again. The scope mount had been slowly loosening for weeks, something she'd been meaning to address with proper tools and proper time, but proper time had become a luxury she couldn't locate. Every group she fired drifted. Every adjustment she made seemed to correct for one variable and introduce another. She was chasing her own shots, and she knew it, and it was making her quietly furious in that way that has nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. Because this was the last thing she had left that felt like hers. Dara's marriage had ended 14 months ago, clean, legally speaking, devastating, personally speaking. Her daughter, Mila, was 7 years old and spent every other weekend 90 miles away. And those weekends were the ones where Dara drove long distances and stood on ranges and tried to remember who she was before she became someone's ex-wife, someone's part-time mother, someone swallowed whole by a life that hadn't quite fit. She had been a nationally ranked precision shooter in her mid-20s, top 15 in her division. She'd had sponsors, a coach, a whole architecture of discipline built around her ability to be still, to breathe, to calculate, to wait, and then to act at exactly the right moment. Then life had happened in the way that life sometimes happens to the people who think they have it planned, gradually, then completely. Now she stood in lane 7, fighting a loose scope mount, watching her shots drift low and left and breathing through it. She swapped to the target in lane 6, which was unoccupied and had a fresh paper hung that morning. Thought maybe a clean slate, a different lane, a different target might give her a reset. Shooters did this sometimes, no rule against it. She settled in, reset her breathing, pressed her cheek against the stock. She didn't notice the man who had stepped into the adjacent lane until he was already there. He moved the way people move when they've spent years in environments where unnecessary motion is a liability. Economical, quiet, like every step had been decided before it was taken. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, though he carried the specific kind of age that doesn't soften a person, but instead carves them down to something essential. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at distances most people never looked toward. His hands, when he set his case on the bench, moved with the automatic care of someone for whom equipment is not a hobby but a language. His name was Marcus Hale. And he said nothing at first because he rarely did. He had been coming to this range for 11 years. It was far from where he lived, which was exactly why he chose it. He had a house, technically, in a suburb 40 minutes north, but the house was more of a checkpoint than a home. A place to sleep and receive mail, and occasionally cook something that wasn't out of a can. He had been medically separated from the teams 18 months ago, after a training injury that had quietly ended the last chapter of a 22-year career. His left knee had been surgically rebuilt twice. He walked without a limp because he had worked violently hard at physical therapy, but there were mornings when the stairs reminded him of everything that was gone. He didn't talk about his service to strangers. Not because he was ashamed, there was no shame in any of it, but because the words that existed in regular conversation didn't match the weight of what those years had actually been. So when people asked, he said he'd been in the military, and he let them fill in whatever picture made them comfortable, and he moved on. He clipped his target at 50 yards, though he was planning to move it out significantly. He always started close, got his zero confirmed, built outward from certainty. He loaded, settled, and fired 3 rounds in under 4 seconds. The grouping, if you had walked down and looked at it, would have covered less surface area than a quarter. He noticed her. Not in any particular way, not romantically, not judgmentally, but in the way that trained observers notice everything within their peripheral awareness. She was in lane 7, working a bolt action, and something was wrong with her rifle. He could tell from the way she kept adjusting, the slight pause before each shot that was too long to be technique and too short to be a rest. And the way she pressed her lips together after each group like she was receiving bad news she'd already expected. He said nothing. It wasn't his range and it wasn't his business. But then he noticed she had moved to his lane's target, not to harass him, not deliberately. She had simply migrated, the way shooters sometimes do when they're testing variables, to the neighboring lane's fresh paper. She was using his target. He watched this for a moment. Not with irritation, with the kind of patient curiosity that asks, what is this person trying to work out? He watched her fire another group, saw the drift, saw her jaw tighten. Saw her pull the rifle up slightly and look at the scope mount with the focused expression of someone diagnosing a problem they've known about for a while and kept hoping would resolve itself. He leaned slightly against the lane divider. Having trouble with the mount, he said. His voice was low, not unfriendly but not warm in the casual way that strangers are warm. It was the voice of someone who speaks when they have something to say. Dara looked at him. She had the specific guardedness of a woman who has learned, across many years and many ranges, to manage the particular way some men approach her in shooting spaces. The unsolicited advice. The gentle condescension dressed up as helpfulness. The assumption that her struggle must be a beginner's problem rather than a specific mechanical failure on a rifle she knew intimately. "I've got it," she said, not aggressively, just firmly. He nodded once and returned to his own lane. She fired again. The shot drifted. She muttered something under her breath, something quiet and sharp, and not meant for anyone else's ears. He had moved his target back to 100 yards and fired another 3 rounds. If she had looked, she would have seen it. She didn't look. He moved it to 150, fired, adjusted fractionally, fired again. She kept working, kept chasing the drift. Kept not getting where she needed to be. 20 minutes passed in the cadence of the range, the overlapping sound of other lanes, the periodic ceasefire calls from the range master. The smell of the morning deepening into something warmer as the sun climbed, and the ventilation struggled. Dara set her rifle down on the bench and put her hands flat on the surface beside it, just breathed. This was a technique she'd learned a long time ago from a coach whose name she still carried like a quiet monument inside herself. When the body is fighting the tool, take your hands off the tool. The man in the next lane was now shooting at what appeared to be 200 yards. She heard his shots, registered the rhythm of them, not the frantic, compensating rhythm of someone struggling, but the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who has all the time in the world, because they've already done this 10,000 times, and they know exactly what they're doing. She looked briefly at his target when the ceasefire came and people walked downrange to check their groups. She stopped walking. She stood there, maybe 40 feet from his target, and she looked at what he had done at 200 yards with open iron sights, because she could see now that there was no scope on his rifle. Just irons, and the group was something that most people would have called impossible if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. 5 rounds, one hole essentially, with slight variation. A group so tight it looked like the target had a single entry wound from something much larger than a rifle round. She stood there for a moment longer than she meant to. When she walked back to the line, she was quiet in a different way than before. She was re-examining her scope mount when he spoke again. "The problem isn't your fundamentals," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was running a cleaning patch through his barrel. "I can tell from your grip and your breathing cycle. The shot break is clean, it's the hardware." She looked at him. There was something different in how she heard it this time. She had just seen what this man could do at 200 yards with iron sights. That grouping had rearranged something in her chest, not humbled her exactly, but recalibrated her sense of who she was dealing with. "The mount has been loose," she admitted. "I've been meaning to get it torqued properly." "It's not just the torque," he said. "The base is worn. You can see the play if you hold it at angle and work the scope gently." She picked up the rifle and did exactly that. The play was visible. Small, maybe a millimeter of total movement, but at distance, that millimeter became everything. "Yeah," she said quietly. "There it is." He set down his cleaning rod, reached into his case and drew out his rifle, a precision bolt action, custom work, the kind of rifle that took years of choices and modifications to become what it was. He set it on the bench and stepped back from it, one full step back, in the way that someone sets something down and removes themselves from it entirely. "Try mine," he said. She looked at the rifle, then at him, then back at the rifle. "I'm not. It's already zeroed for 200. I was going to move the target to 250, but I can reset it." He paused. "Try it. Work out what your hands actually know how to do without a variable getting in the way." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face, or more accurately, something in the absence of performance in his face that made her trust this. He was not showing off. He was not trying to impress her. He was not managing some complicated social dynamic. He had simply seen a shooter being failed by her equipment, and he had offered the most logical solution, and then stepped back to give her room. She stepped forward and picked up the rifle. The weight of it settled into her hands differently, properly. The balance was extraordinary, clearly fitted and adjusted by someone who understood weight distribution the way some people understand music. She brought it up slowly. "Don't change anything about your form," he said. He was behind her and to the left, not hovering, not close, just present. "Just shoot what you know." She found the target at 200, breathed. Everything in her went still in the particular way it used to go still when she was 26 and ranked and certain of herself. That stillness she'd been chasing all morning. She broke the shot. The round went exactly where she wanted it. She fired again, same place, and again. She lowered the rifle slowly. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with recognition. The recognition of herself, the version of herself she'd been trying to find all morning. Still in there, still capable, still precise. "That's your natural zero," he said. "Your eye, your breathing, your trigger discipline, it's all there. Your rifle was just lying to you." She turned to face him and she asked, more quietly than she intended, "How long have you been shooting?" He considered the question in the way he considered most questions, not stalling, but actually thinking about it. "Since I was 12, he said. "Seriously, since I was 19. Military?" "Yeah," she nodded, didn't push. She had the sense that pushing would collapse something that was better left standing. But then she looked at the rifle again. The rifle that had just given her back something she thought she'd lost. And she looked at the serial number on the lower receiver, and there was a small engraving beside it. The kind of personalization that some service members add, subtle, usually meaningful only to them. She looked at it closely. 2 letters and a number, KB7. She went very still. KB7, she said, almost to herself. He looked at her. What did you say? His voice hadn't changed in volume. But something behind it had shifted, something pressurized. She looked up at him. This engraving, KB7. The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. On a range with background noise and distant shots and ventilation hum, 4 seconds is a long time. Where do you know that from? He said. Kyle Belmont, she said. 7 years ago, a man named Kyle Belmont pulled a woman and a 7-year-old girl out of a flooding drainage culvert outside of Ridgecrest. The girl had a fractured wrist and a head laceration. The woman had her arm dislocated from where someone had grabbed her from the water. The man who pulled them out, the man who had been driving past and stopped his truck and went in after them without any hesitation. He left before the paramedics knew who he was. The woman spent 2 years trying to find him. She left his name with every veterans organization she could contact, every service registry. She wanted to thank him. She never found him. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. The girl was my daughter, she said. Mila. She was 3 months old from her 4th birthday. The woman was me. Marcus Hale looked at her. The range continued around them. Distant shots. A range master calling something 2 lanes down. The ventilation system cycling. But all of it existed at a great remove from the space between these 2 people. Kyle Belmont had been his spotter for 6 years, his partner. They had cleared buildings together and waited in the dark together and trusted each other with the specific totality that only comes from having had your life in another person's hands on enough occasions that the concept of debt becomes meaningless because the ledger is too complicated to count. Kyle Belmont had died 22 months ago, aneurysm, 41 years old. In his kitchen on a Tuesday morning with no warning and no drama and no battlefield, which had felt like a particular cruelty. The initials engraved on the rifle were Kyle's. The engraving was something Kyle had put on his personal rifle years ago, a joke at first about his own call sign, then something that just stayed. When Kyle died and Marcus had been asked if there was anything of Kyle's he wanted to keep, he had asked for the rifle. Not as a trophy, as a presence. He carried it here. He shot with it, because shooting with it meant Kyle was still somehow in the lane beside him. Marcus looked at this woman who had driven 2 hours to be nobody, to be alone, to find herself in the one discipline that had always made sense to her, and he understood. In the full weight of the word, what the universe occasionally does when it is feeling particularly precise. He talked about that, Marcus said. His voice was different now, not broken but deeper, reaching down from somewhere. He told me about it. He'd been driving back from his sister's place. He saw the car off the road and the water was all ready. He stopped, started again. He said he didn't think about it. He said there was a little girl. He said she was so quiet when he got her out. Too quiet, and it scared him. And he held her against his chest until she started crying. And he said that was the best sound he'd ever heard in his life. Dara Ellison pressed her lips together hard. She looked at the rifle in her hands. This rifle that he had handed to her and stepped back from. This rifle that had given her back her shot. This rifle that had belonged to the man who had given her back her daughter. She held it a moment longer, not tightly, not desperately, but with the particular reverence of someone holding something they understand the full value of. Then she turned it carefully and offered it back to him with both hands. He took it. They stood on either side of the bench in lane 6, and the noise of the range continued, and neither of them spoke for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been 3 minutes. Because time in moments like this does not behave the way it is supposed to. He should have received something, she said finally, some kind of acknowledgement. He wouldn't have wanted it, Marcus said, and there was no bitterness in this, no martyrdom. Just an accurate description of a man he had known completely. He would have said he was just nearby. He would have made a joke about his truck needing a wash. A sound came from Dara that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. "Your daughter," Marcus said. "She's okay. She's 7 now," Dara said. "She's..." Her voice caught the edge of something and she held it and continued, "She's extraordinary." He nodded, not a dismissive nod. The kind of nod that means, "I understand what that word costs to say. I understand what she survived to be extraordinary." Later, after the range had quieted and the other shooters had packed up and the range master had done his sweep, Marcus helped Dara assess the scope mount damage properly. He had a small toolkit in his bag, he usually did, and they worked through it together in the practical, quiet language of two people who both know what they're doing and don't need to perform for each other. He recommended a gunsmith 2 towns north who did precise work without charging for the name. He wrote the name on a small card from his wallet. She looked at the card, looked at him. "Would you tell me more about him?" she asked. "About Kyle, if you ever wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I think I would." The drive home was 2 hours. Dara drove it in a different silence than the one she'd arrived with. Not lighter exactly, heavier in some ways. But the weight of it was different. The weight of something that has been answered rather than the weight of something still asked. There is a particular thing that happens to grief when it finds its missing shape. It doesn't leave. It doesn't become joy. It becomes something that can be held, something with edges you can feel and dimensions you can know. And that is different from the grief that has no form. That seeps into every room and corner and has no place where it ends. Somewhere on a highway between the range and home. Dara thought about a little girl held against the chest of a stranger in the cold water, held there until she cried. And she thought about a man who had saved her daughter's life and never told anyone his name. And she thought about the rifle in lane 6, and the way the shot had gone exactly where she wanted it, finally, after a whole morning of fighting. And she thought that sometimes the world lines things up in ways that make no logical sense and cannot be explained, and should probably not be explained. Because the moment you explain a thing like this, it becomes smaller than it actually is. Some things are supposed to stay full. Some shots, when they finally find their mark, are meant to be felt rather than measured. She drove, and the highway stretched ahead of her, and somewhere 90 miles away, a 7-year-old girl named Mila was probably drawing something impractical with too many colors. And that was enough. That right now was everything.